Section: Introduction. In this section, we discuss the limitations of chain of thought, COT, prompting, particularly its tendency to produce explanations that can be misleading or incorrect, even if they seem plausible. While these unfaithful explanations do not hinder COT's effectiveness in enhancing model performance, they limit its usefulness for justifying responses to users. Despite various attempts to address this issue, detecting and measuring unfaithfulness remains challenging. We recognize that the diverse forms of COT explanations complicate their analysis. Our aim is to simplify the analysis of COT explanations while maintaining their effectiveness and flexibility. To achieve this, we introduce a new variant called Program Trace Prompting, PTP, which organizes COT demonstrations using a semi-formal syntax. This syntax identifies and names steps, defines their input-output behavior, and replaces traditional COT explanations with structured chains of these formalized steps. In our approach, we use Python-like syntax to describe the steps, and we provide documentation that outlines the behavior of a hypothetical program along with traces of its actions on sample inputs. Each subroutine represents a different type of step, and we include comments and type signatures for clarity. We then prompt a language model with this structured information and ask it to generate a trace for a new input, from which we extract the final answer. Importantly, we do not present actual code to the model, nor do we execute any code. Instead, the model generates a new trace that aligns with the provided examples. The traces we create are best viewed as pseudocode, as they often require background knowledge that cannot be directly implemented in Python. We demonstrate that PTP is versatile, successfully applying it to 23 diverse tasks in the BIG bench-hard benchmark, achieving accuracy comparable to traditional COT prompts. Our generated traces are typically well-formed, with over 99% of steps being correctly structured, and more than 95% of function calls being valid Python objects. Additionally, PTP allows us to execute individual steps and solve complete tasks. For example, we can modify inputs to generate specific steps in the trace, achieving over 90% accuracy across multiple tasks. We also show that PTP traces can be analyzed for errors in ways that traditional COT explanations cannot, particularly by evaluating the modularity of steps. A step is considered modular if its output relies solely on its designated inputs, without influence from previous text. We present methods for automatically detecting non-modular steps and find that most steps in our tasks are indeed modular. This explicit representation of steps enables us to pinpoint reasoning errors to specific steps, although a final answer may still be incorrect due to what we term non-local errors. These errors occur when the model misinterprets the algorithm from the provided traces. In summary, our contributions include 1. A new framework for COT prompting that facilitates detailed analysis of reasoning steps. 2. Validation of this framework across a variety of tasks. 3. Methods for evaluating the modularity of steps and locality of errors. And 4. An analysis of step modularity across a broad set of tasks. Section Summary. In this section, we introduce Program Trace Prompting, PTP, a new framework that enhances chain of thought, COT, prompting by formalizing the explanation steps, allowing for better analysis and evaluation of reasoning processes. We demonstrate PTP's effectiveness across diverse tasks, showing that it maintains accuracy while enabling detailed assessment of modularity and locality of errors in reasoning. Section: Methods. In this section, we describe our methods and data. We utilize the Big Bench hard tasks to assess our approach, which consists of 23 challenging tasks for large language models, LLMs. Each task employs 3 examples with chain-of-thought prompts, and they are suitable for evaluation since their answers can be easily verified, mostly being multiple choice. About half of these tasks fall under NLP and involve high-level reasoning that requires some low-level AI routines. The other half are algorithmic tasks, solvable through simple extraction rules and algorithms, such as evaluating Boolean expressions or reasoning about the order of a few objects. For our experiments, we created program trace prompts that closely aligned with the existing chain of thought prompts for each task. We made adjustments to these prompts to ensure the model followed the examples closely and produced outputs that were easy to parse. We also occasionally corrected errors in the prompts. We employed a semi-automatic method to generate our prompts, manually writing Python programs that implement the algorithms suggested by the prompts. These programs, which we refer to as mocks, only need to work for the few examples provided in the prompts. For instance, one mock retrieves values from a small dictionary based on the entities mentioned in the prompt. When executed, mocks print a trace that primarily records function calls and may include printed outputs, such as the final answer to a question. Our mock development process is semi-automatic since we write the mocks by hand. While many mocks are simple wrappers around the steps in the prompts, some decisions require careful consideration. To avoid overfitting, we used 60 random examples from each task to design the mocks, reserving the remaining examples for a final test set. We divided the 60 examples into development and tuning sets, each containing 30 examples. Decisions about mock implementation were based on the performance of the development data, but the values in the mocks were derived from the prompts, not the development set. The tuning set was set aside for annotation experiments. This approach differs from typical uses of the big bench hard tasks, which usually evaluate new LLMs using the provided prompts without a standard development test split to prevent overfitting. An interesting feature of our program trace prompting is that the same prompt can be used to predict traces for either the entire inference process or individual steps. For example, to predict a trace for a specific step, we can simply replace the code fragment at the end of the prompt. This allows us to explore the behavior of mocks in a way similar to interactive debugging. We also apply this method for various analytical tasks. Section Summary. In this section, we evaluated our approach using the big bench hard tasks, a diverse set of 23 challenging tasks for LLMs, employing 3-shot COT prompts to ensure correctness in answers. We developed semi-automatic program trace prompts, allowing for both full inference and single-step execution, which facilitates interactive debugging and analysis of the model's behavior. Section: Improvements to single-step prompting. In this section, we discuss improvements to single-step prompting. We observe that the outcomes of single-step prompting tend to be more variable compared to program trace prompting, PTP, on complete examples. A frequent issue with single-step prompts is that the language model, LLM, often starts with the requested step but continues to generate additional steps, which we refer to as overgeneration. We can reduce overgeneration in 2 ways. First, we can add single-step traces to the stubs of the subroutine we are examining. Our findings show that even adding traces from the top-level examples enhances the performance of single-step prompting. The second method involves using more effective techniques to extract output from single-step generations, such as parsing the trace to identify steps and then using the return value from the first step with the correct subroutine name as the single-step result. More details can be found in the section and appendix. Next, we can use a similar prompting technique to complete a trace when we have a prefix of it. Instead of asking the model to generate a trace, we ask it to complete the existing one. Further information is available in the appendix. Regarding language models, we note that PTP can theoretically be applied to any LLM. After initial studies, we chose to work with Anthropic's Sonnet 3 model, as it strikes a good balance between cost, reliability, and performance. Unless stated otherwise, this is the model we used in our experiments. We aim to enhance chain of thought, COT, prompts for easier analysis without compromising performance. Therefore, we first compare the overall accuracy of PTP prompts to the COT prompts they are based on. The results, summarized in a table, show that we generally use the first PTP prompt for each task evaluated on the test data to avoid overfitting. Our findings strongly support our initial claim that PTP is applicable across a wide range of tasks without significantly affecting performance. Out of 23 diverse tasks, only one task experienced a notable drop in performance when switching to a more precise explanation format. Conversely, 3 tasks showed significant performance improvements, and the average performance of PTP prompts slightly exceeded that of the COT baselines. We also present results comparing PTP and COT prompting for several other proprietary models and one strong closed model, DeepSeek Coder v2. These experiments were conducted on a subset of the data, specifically the development set for 6 tasks representing various types and accuracy levels. For most models, the average performance was similar for both prompting methods, although PTP showed lower relative performance on Gemini Flash and GPT-4o Mini. We plan to discuss open-source models in future work. Our experimental approach differs from most previous studies, but the COT baseline we used is robust compared to many earlier papers, as shown in the appendix. We also evaluate whether the generated traces are syntactically well-formed. The primary goal of PTP is to create structured explanations for deeper analysis of COT performance. To ensure the explanations have the intended structure, we develop tools to automatically assess generated traces for specific properties. We check for call correctness by parsing traces to see if they contain any hallucinated calls to functions not mentioned in the prompt or if they form a well-structured function call trace. For well-formed traces, we verify the syntactic correctness of arguments and return values according to Python's rules. We also check for type correctness based on the type hints provided in the stubs for each step. While our analysis primarily requires call correctness, we find that PTP generally produces traces that are also syntax and type correct. We provide a detailed breakdown of this analysis for each task and a summary average across all tasks. Most syntactic errors arise from strings with incorrectly escaped characters. Our analysis supports our second claim that traces generated by PTP can almost always be automatically parsed into valid sequences of the predefined steps associated with the prompt, allowing us to further analyze the traces and identify their errors. Section Summary. In this section, we discuss improvements to single-step prompting, highlighting that overgeneration can be mitigated by adding relevant traces and using robust output extraction methods. We also demonstrate that program trace prompting, PTP, maintains performance across various tasks while producing structured, syntactically correct traces, enabling deeper analysis of model outputs. Section. What kinds of errors are made? In this section, we explore the types of errors that can occur during reasoning with program trace prompting, PTP. The PTP prompt outlines the meaning of each step, allowing us to identify where errors happen. Generally, errors can be classified as local errors, where a step gives an incorrect output, or non-local errors, where the sequence of steps is incorrect. We found that the most frequent non-local error involves taking values from the wrong source. We manually reviewed all traces from the tuning set that resulted in incorrect outcomes, marking the first incorrect step output or labeling the trace as having a non-local error if no clear mistake was found. Our findings indicate that non-local errors are relatively uncommon, appearing in only about 2.6% of the traces, and they mainly occurred in a few specific tasks. Over 80% of these errors were concentrated in just 3 tasks: Dyke languages, geometric shapes, and formal fallacies, while more than 85% of tasks had very few non-local errors. Additionally, non-local errors are challenging to detect, even for careful annotators. However, they are significant, as 22% of the incorrect traces were identified as having non-local errors. We hypothesize that these errors are linked to the complexity of learning the correct sequence of steps, suggesting that they arise when the algorithm indicated by the COT trace is complicated and hard to learn. To investigate this, we analyzed the traces for each task in the test examples. We simplified each legal trace by removing specific arguments and return values, resulting in an abstract trace. For instance, multiple traces might share the same abstract trace, like analyze_input sport_ for consistent_sports. Some tasks generated only one abstract trace for all test examples, while others produced a variety of abstract traces, especially those with inputs of different sizes or structures. We calculated the entropy of the distribution of abstract traces for each task, revealing a clear link between high trace entropy and non-local errors. The 3 tasks with the highest non-local error rates also had the highest trace entropy, with a correlation coefficient of 0.51. In contrast, the correlation between error rate and the number of steps in the trace was only 0.04. In summary, using PTP not only uncovers non-local errors but also helps us predict where they might occur. This highlights an additional role of COT prompting. Beyond facilitating reasoning, it provides a strategy for solving tasks that the model can learn. This strategy learning appears to be effective for tasks of low to medium complexity. Next, we address the reliability of learning individual steps. While PTP traces appear to consist of well-defined steps with clear inputs and outputs, previous evaluations of COT explanations suggest that this might be misleading. To assess whether a step is meaningful, we examined how well the model can execute individual steps using our prompting method. Evaluating single steps is challenging due to the lack of gold standard outputs. However, some steps in the BBH tasks can be easily encoded with rules, allowing us to use general Python routines instead of specific dictionaries. We evaluated the correctness of these steps using corresponding Python functions as a reference. In the BBH suite, we identified 16 different steps across 5 tasks that could be tested this way, executing a total of 480 steps based on the inputs used in the development set examples. The results showed an overall accuracy of over 90%, indicating that the steps are meaningful and that the model can effectively execute them in a step-by-step manner, with each step being an independent call to the model. We applied the full method described earlier, including techniques to manage overgeneration, and found that these methods each contributed to a performance increase of 3 to 4 points. Additionally, we compared the accuracy of these steps when executed within the context of problem solving, noting that even the best single-step prompt performed worse than when the steps were part of a PTP trace. Section Summary. In this section, we identify 2 types of errors in program trace prompting, PTP, reasoning. Local errors, where a step produces a wrong output, and non-local errors, which arise from using an incorrect sequence of steps, with the latter being less common but more challenging to detect. We also demonstrate that while individual steps in PTP traces are meaningful and can be executed with high accuracy, the complexity of the task correlates with the occurrence of non-local errors, suggesting that these errors are linked to the difficulty of learning the correct sequence of steps. Section. Why measuring performance of a single step is hard. In this section, we discuss the challenges of measuring the performance of a single step in our tasks. We note that, unlike the steps listed in our table, there are often no clear benchmarks available. This is because the output may involve natural language or because the effectiveness of a step can depend on how it interacts with subsequent problem-solving tasks. We informally define a step as non-modular if its performance differs when prompted individually compared to when it is part of a larger task. To illustrate this, we conducted a simple experiment where we altered a specific step in the sports understanding task by removing its first input. This step is designed to compare 2 sports descriptions, which logically requires the first description. We anticipated that this change would reduce accuracy, but surprisingly, when we evaluated it, the accuracy remained statistically the same as the original version. This occurs because the language model, LLM, can reference previous text when generating outputs, allowing it to still arrive at the correct answer despite the modification. Next, we attempted to restrict the LLM to only consider the designated inputs for this step by modifying the trace. We extracted the altered step, prompted it individually, and then regenerated the rest of the trace. We refer to this process as an intervention. Interestingly, even with this forced modularity, the accuracy did not significantly change. Upon closer examination, we found that while the forced modular version produced different outputs, matching the in-context step only about 56.8% of the time, the LLM often added an extra call to the consistent sport step during trace completion, which then provided the correct answer. Thus, the intervention maintained similar accuracy but slightly increased the average number of steps taken. This leads us to consider measuring non-modularity not just through accuracy but also through other statistics, such as trace length, to identify compensations made by the LLM during forced modular interventions. We will detail this process further. To define and measure modularity, we represent a program trace as a series of steps, where each step has a function name, a set of inputs, and an output. We can model the LLM's outputs as a joint distribution over these variables, where each output depends on the entire preceding sequence. For a step to be considered modular, its output must depend solely on its specific function and inputs, independent of other steps. To assess modularity, we replace the output of a specific step with the result from a single step prompt and then extend the trace. If we assume that completing a trace does not alter the distribution of outputs, we can compare the distributions before and after our intervention. If the step is modular, the distributions should remain unchanged. We also consider summary statistics derived from the trace, such as trace length and correctness. By sampling inputs and calculating these statistics before and after our intervention, we can detect changes in modularity. We use statistical tests to analyze these changes, including a sign test for correctness and a paired t-test for the number of steps. For abstract traces, we check if the divergence between the two distributions exceeds expected levels using a permutation test. Section Summary. In this section, we discuss the challenges of measuring single-step performance in LLMs, highlighting that steps can behave differently when isolated compared to their context in a larger problem-solving task, a phenomenon we term non-modularity. We propose a method to assess modularity by forcing steps to operate independently and analyzing changes in output distributions and trace statistics, revealing that even when steps are forced to be modular, accuracy may remain unchanged due to compensatory behaviors of the LLM. Section: Which tasks are non-modular? In this section, we explore which tasks are non-modular. We first recap our earlier findings. In one section, we demonstrated that we can prompt the model to perform individual steps accurately on their own. We then defined modularity, explaining that steps are modular if they rely solely on their specified inputs, without being influenced by other parts of the process. We also introduced a method to assess the modularity of a step through forced modularity interventions. This method involves two key changes. First, we replace the output of a step with a modular version, and second, we regenerate the rest of the process. We can only assess the impact of the first change if we are sure that the second change does not alter the distribution, which we refer to as stable incremental generation. In our evaluation, we looked at the results of the forced modularity intervention on certain steps from our previous table using development data. The columns labeled with p-values indicate whether the step altered the distribution of the statistic, with smaller values suggesting a significant change. We also applied a correction for multiple tests, highlighting corrected p-values below 0.1 in italics and those below 0.05 in bold. For steps with low corrected p-values, we further tested the stable incremental generation assumption using a different intervention, where we only regenerated the trace after truncating it at a specific step. We found that this assumption did not hold for 3 steps, leaving their modularity status unclear. For the solve negations step, we found no evidence against the assumption, while there was weak evidence against it for the rewrite expressions step. Thus, we classified the Boolean expressions step as non-modular and the other as likely non-modular. We noted that the non-modular steps corresponded to cases where single-step prompts performed poorly. We also observed that correctness is not the most useful summary statistic for our data. In contrast, when we examined simpler NLP tasks, we summarized the results of repeating our experiment on 25 steps from 12 tasks. We focused on steps that were more prone to local errors. Only 3 steps showed a significant distributional shift due to the forced modularity intervention, and one of these might be explained by a failure of the stable incremental generation assumption. We concluded that non-modularity is uncommon in NLP tasks, and the traditional accuracy statistic is not sensitive enough to detect significant changes. Next, we discuss understanding chain of thought, COT, prompting and measuring faithfulness. There has been extensive research on COT prompting and reasoning in large language models, LLMs. The most relevant prior work analyzes why COT is effective and when it may fail. Several hypotheses have been proposed regarding COT's success, including the idea that longer outputs provide additional computational power needed for complex tasks. More importantly, it has been suggested that COT reveals inherent reasoning abilities in language models, which arise from natural language phenomena. This is supported by the observation that phrases like, "let's think step by step," often enhance LLM performance. The metaphor of unlocking reasoning is compelling, which may explain the limited research on how COT prompts can teach models specific reasoning methods and how LLM behavior can be influenced by presenting method traces. Our findings illustrate that COT prompts can also introduce new information to the LLM, as the steps outline a specific strategy for task completion that the LLM can learn from. The concepts of modularity and locality we explored are closely tied to the idea of COT explanation faithfulness. Previous work noted that when LLMs exhibit biases, COT prompting can sometimes produce explanations that maintain these biases while appearing plausible. This unfaithful explanation is concerning, as it can mislead users or complicate efforts to optimize LLM behavior. Later studies have reinforced these observations, proposing various methods to measure faithfulness, including some that numerically assess influence in neural networks. We build on previous work that measures faithfulness by altering generated explanations and observing the impact on accuracy. We extend this by focusing on forced modularity changes, using new statistics to gauge the effects, and examining the specific notions of step modularity and error locality. Our work is also informed by research on error recovery in COT models and its implications for measuring faithfulness. Section Summary. In this section, we evaluate the modularity of various steps in our model by applying forced modularity interventions and analyzing their impact on distributional changes. Our findings indicate that non-modularity is rare in NLP tasks, with only a few steps showing significant shifts, and we emphasize the importance of measuring faithfulness in COT explanations to ensure they accurately reflect model behavior. Section: Calling Python from LLMs. In this section, we discuss how we can enhance the reasoning abilities of large language models, LLMs, by integrating them with symbolic methods, particularly those based on Python. One approach involves having an LLM create a Python program for each specific task, which is then executed to find the answer. Another method is tool use, where the LLM alternates between generating text and executing symbolic tools. A third option is to generate Python-like pseudocode, which resembles Python syntax but includes routines that the LLM must emulate rather than execute directly. Among these, the pseudocode approach is similar to our program trace prompting. However, previous research aimed to create a single program applicable to all task instances, while our method generates a unique trace for each task without needing a pre-existing program. Additionally, unlike earlier methods, program trace prompting is a straightforward prompting technique rather than a hybrid LLM, symbolic architecture, which simplifies the process. We also introduce a novel way to measure faithfulness. Next, we explore how we can call LLMs from Python. This common method involves breaking down a task into smaller steps that can be handled through multiple LLM calls. Tools like DSPy and LangChain support this approach, allowing for clear task decomposition and performance optimization on subtasks. Our program trace prompting achieves this within a single prompt, making it generally more efficient. We also address chain of thought, COT, prompting, which is effective but costly to gather examples for and challenging to optimize. While synthetic generation and optimization can help, previous work has looked into semi-automatic COT prompt generation using extractive rationales from classification decisions. Our approach offers new ways to semi-automatically create COT prompts, but it is specifically tailored for generating program trace prompts. Lastly, we touch on learning from program traces, a concept studied for decades under various names like programming by example. Although there has been limited research on this in the context of LLMs, we propose using program traces to create controllable chain of thought prompts for specific tasks, rather than merely for generating analytical data.